Hello, everyone. My name is Catriona Steele, and it's my pleasure to be participating in this webinar on how to use IDDSI in research. Just a little bit of background about me. I am trained as a speech-language pathologist, and I lead a research lab at the Kite Research Institute of the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute University Health Network. And my research is focused on understanding swallowing physiology and designing effective rehabilitation for dysphagia. Since 2012, I have been one of the founding and continuing board members of the IDDSI Board of Directors. And one of my roles on the board has been to be the lead for research regarding IDDSI. So it's my pleasure to be leading this webinar today. On this slide, I'm showing an agenda for what I hope to cover in today's webinar. I'm going to start with just a brief overview of IDDSI-related publications that have taken place since 2012. These are official IDDSI publications. And I'd like to look with you at how these publications have impacted the research literature in terms of the number of citations and other studies that have used these publications. I then want to summarize the themes that we see emerging in research regarding IDDSI today, and then move into a number of key messages or lessons learned regarding the use of IDDSI in research. And it's important to say that my perspective here is colored both by my role on the board of directors and my role as a researcher looking very closely at IDDSI and its impact on swallowing, but also my role as an associate editor for the Dysphagia Journal and a guest editor or reviewer for other journals where I see quite a number of submissions for publication where the IDDSI framework has been used. And so I want to go through a number of issues that have arisen in the publication world that I think are important to bring to your attention as potential researchers using IDDSI. I hope that we will then have plenty of time for interactive discussion and questions and answers from you, and that I can be helpful in addressing some of those questions. So without further ado, then let's move into discussing IDDSI and its place in the research literature. Now, as you probably know, the idea of launching IDDSI began back in 2012 when a small number of the current board of directors met together at an industry-sponsored conference and began to dream and talk about the idea of establishing a new system of common terminology to describe the textures and consistencies of foods and liquids used in dysphagia management. And over the course of our work together, we have published about 6 official manuscripts from IDDSI, and 2 of those are shown here on the slide. The first here shown on the left was our concept paper, which was published in 2014, where we discussed why we felt there was a need to establish a new taxonomy for texture labeling. And in that paper, we looked also at existing frameworks that were in place around the world and tried to compare and contrast them, showing the different types of labeling systems that were in place, whether those were words or letters of the alphabet or numbers, and also illustrating how the different frameworks from different countries didn't easily map to each other, leading to the potential for considerable confusion. On the right of the slide, you see the second official IDDSI publication, which was released in 2015. And this is the systematic review project that we undertook and for which I was the lead, where we scoured the available research literature at the time to understand what was known about the effects of food texture or liquid consistency on swallowing physiology, both in healthy people and in people with dysphagia. And as you may recall, we found that there were considerable gaps in the available evidence, but there was a general sense that thickening liquids was helpful for reducing penetration aspiration and airway invasion. And at the same time, there was some sense in the literature that there might be a trade-off going on, that as one thickened liquids further and further, that one might start to see increasing residue as a consequence, and thereby the efficiency of swallowing might be negatively impacted. At that time in 2015, the research literature did not clearly identify specific numbers or values or measures of the consistency of a liquid or the texture of a food that represented clear boundaries along the continuum where one would move from a liquid that was less safe to a liquid that was more safe, and that we really couldn't pinpoint values of, for example, viscosity that showed evidence of being therapeutic. On this next slide, you can see probably the two most important publications that have come out of IDDSI since its inception. On the left, you see the first release of the IDDSI framework, meaning the terminology, the testing methods, and the definitions. And this came out electronically in 2016 and officially in early 2017. And at that point in time, we had 5 levels of liquid consistency, from thin through slightly thick, mildly thick, moderately thick, and extremely thick. And then we also had 5 levels of food texture, starting at level 3, which overlapped, of course, with the liquid side of the framework. So that level 3 liquidized foods were identical in their properties to level 3 moderately thick liquids, and similarly level 4 pureed foods were identical in their properties to level 4 extremely thick liquids. And then the remaining levels of food on the first issue of the framework were level 5 minced and moist foods, level 6 soft and bite-sized, and level 7 regular foods. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the subsequent release in 2019 of an update to the framework, where based on feedback from users, we decided to subdivide level 7 regular foods into level 7 easy to chew, and the remainder, meaning the infinite number of foods that don't have a modified texture and sit at the very top of the framework. And so it is this second release that is currently in place, and we hope will remain locked for some time. And then on this slide, I'm showing the 5th official IDDSI publication, which came out in 2017 and is the first story about implementation of IDDSI as a framework in a hospital. And this story describes the journey at a hospital in the town of Kempen in Germany, where in fact they hadn't had a diet texture modification system in place prior to the introduction of IDDSI, and where the speech language pathologists and clinical team worked together with the chef in the kitchen and also with IDDSI to introduce the IDDSI framework and describe that process. And then finally on this slide, I'm showing 2 publications that are sort of grandchildren, if you will, of the official IDDSI research enterprise. These are publications first authored by members of the board of directors that were undertaken with IDDSI's knowledge and IDDSI's blessing, but were not official projects of IDDSI at that time. On the left, you see work done in my lab to develop a functional diet scale to capture the degree of diet texture restriction that is in place for a patient as an outcome measure that could be tracked over time. We call this, of course, the IDDSI Functional Diet Scale, or IDDSI FDS. And on the right, you see a more recent publication by my colleague Ben Hansen from the board of directors, who undertook to do an engineering dissection, if you will, of the IDDSI flow test and really understand what that test is measuring, and to situate that test in the broader context of rheological measurement of flow properties as an engineer. So those 7 papers, I think, really characterize the official or semi-official output of IDDSI with respect to research publications. And here you can see a citation plot that shows you how many other studies have referenced those original 7 papers over the last few years, dating back to before 2017 until today. And so you can see that this body of work has had a considerable impact in the research literature, with 701 citations of those papers as of last week. So if we look at that body of publications, 700 odd papers that are available today, then I think it's useful to think about what kinds of questions are people pursuing with respect to IDDSI in research today. And there are a number of themes to draw to your attention, and perhaps you're thinking about doing IDDSI related research and are wondering what kinds of questions are out there to be explored. So one of the themes that we see in that body of literature is about terminology. And here in particular, we can find articles that have done a comparison between IDDSI terminology and other systems, such as the Japanese Society for Dysphagia Rehabilitation's framework for labeling texture. And generally, these articles illustrate differences in systems, and in particular highlight zones where the assumed mapping of an item in the Japanese system, for example, may not land where you expect it to land on the IDDSI framework. And so really what we're talking about here are differences in measurement and a comparison of how the flow test measures line up or don't line up with other methods of texture classification. And this leads me very naturally into the next theme that we see, and that is more explicit analysis of the testing methods. And a very strong theme that one can see in this type of literature is a discussion of mismatch. There's a recent article, for example, from Hong Kong, where they took liquids that were known by specific labels and showed that the expected mapping of those labels to the IDDSI framework when you ran tests of those products using the flow test didn't play out the way that people had expected. And so this really has been a way of highlighting to people the importance of measurement and the risk that lies in assumptions. Within this part of the literature, we also see a number of papers where people have tried to map the IDDSI levels to other types of rheological measurement, such as the measurement of shear viscosity, or perhaps on other more accessible measures like the line spread test or use of the Bostwick consistometer. And again, here, the overriding message is that the systems may generally work reasonably well together, but the mapping isn't precise. And I think the really important take-home message here is that the flow test is a measure of the flow of liquid under gravity. It is not a measure of shear viscosity. And just as some of these other tests, like the line spread test, don't measure shear viscosity, and so it may actually not be reasonable in the first place to expect a precise correspondence between these different ways of measuring things. Here we're really dealing with a terminology shift. This is something like shifting from imperial measures to metric measures, but it's not exactly the same as that, because within that transition, you can largely use a mathematical equation to predict from one to the other, but the analogy is quite similar. A third topic where we see a number of papers emerging in the literature is regarding the prevalence and impact of diet texture modifications in certain sectors. So, for example, in the long-term care or nursing home sector, we see articles describing how much texture modification is used, and also drawing relationships between the use of diet texture modification and downstream outcomes. So just as one example, there's been a big study done in Canada in long-term care facilities led by my colleague Heather Keller at the University of Waterloo. And one of the big findings of that study was that residents who were receiving texture modified foods in the form of pureed foods and minced foods had a higher rate of malnutrition. And so that there was an independent relationship between the use of texture modification and adverse or poor nutritional outcomes. Another topic that has become quite popular with relation to the IDDSI framework is to study the behavior of different thickening agents in different liquids or across time, and to measure changes in the resulting products using IDDSI flow testing as the method to characterize the product outcome. I say that this has been an especially active type of research lately in the area of pediatric dysphagia, where people really are scrutinizing the effect of thickeners on baby formula or breast milk. And as part of that, of course, the impact of temperature on those resulting products. There's also quite a lot of emerging literature describing swallowing behavior across different IDDSI levels, both in healthy individuals and in people with different etiologies of dysphagia. This is something that my lab is very actively involved in at this point in time. And so we see the IDDSI levels helping us to rewrite or update what we know about the effects of consistency on swallowing physiology and function. And then there are two other categories of research that I think we see emerging in the literature. And these are both related to implementation. And it's really exciting to see stories starting to be told about implementation. One of this type of study involves research looking at training people to use the IDDSI testing methods. How well are they learning it? How reliable are they in applying those IDDSI testing methods? And what might we learn about training from this type of work? And then the final one, of course, is actual stories of implementation. And here we see work identifying barriers and facilitators of implementations. And we are also just starting to see studies looking at the impact of implementing IDDSI within a healthcare system. And we do hope over time to see more of these studies emerging, showing the benefits of having a clear standard terminology system to guide the use of texture modification for people with dysphagia. So that said, there are also a number of lessons that have emerged and key messages that I want to leave with you regarding the use of IDDSI in research. And the first of those is to very clearly emphasize that the IDDSI framework is a framework, it's not a diet. And this is a conceptual paradigm shift that has taken place with the introduction of IDDSI. So in North America, for example, under the old national dysphagia diet system, there was such a thing as the pureed diet. And the NDD included lists of foods that could be included and foods that could not be included in a pureed diet. The IDDSI framework is completely different in its concept. And so rather than specifying foods or liquids that can or shouldn't be included in a diet, Our goal is that the framework is descriptive rather than prescriptive, and that the tools and testing methods and definitions of the IDDSI framework can be used to characterize the foods that are provided on a patient's diet. So there's a real conceptual shift here from prescribing and limiting to one of characterizing and describing. When we're describing a diet that has been recommended for a patient, the convention with respect to labeling the textures in that diet is to always include two elements. And those elements are the recommended food texture, and that usually is described first, and second, the recommended drink consistency. And so it's not adequate to say a pureed diet, because that's only covering half of this textural equation, but rather one would need to say a pureed food plus such and such a liquid. And so here I've shown on the bottom of the slide an adequate description of a diet texture prescription, including level 6 soft and bite-sized foods and level 2 mildly thick liquids. But to point out here that there's a second conceptual shift in the IDDSI framework that really wasn't part of the old diet prescription methodology, and that is that we have come to believe that the IDDSI framework spans a continuum, and so that these specified levels, level 6 and level 2 in this example, are boundaries of a range of acceptable food textures and liquid consistencies for this particular patient, such that we wouldn't have concern if they were provided a diet or a tray that included items ranging from level 2 to level 6, and perhaps including some items that are level 3, 4, or 5. I should also mention, of course, that there is usually a third specification, in fact, that comes before the food texture and drink consistency specifications in a diet prescription, and that is the therapeutic or nutritional specifications of the diet. And of course, IDDSI at this point in time does not deal with the nutritional formulation or adequacy of a diet prescription. So what does this mean if you're doing research? It means that we would really like to encourage you to capture this information regarding patients or participants in your research studies, to describe both ends of the range of foods and liquids that they are consuming, and not just to focus on one part of that diet description. So a second key message that arises from what we've seen in research literature at this point in time is a difficulty that we're all experiencing related to this transition from what was to what is. And so when we do studies that look backwards in time and want to describe patterns of diet texture prescription or of diet texture use in a facility, the reality is that before IDDSI was implemented, and IDDSI is still in the process of being implemented, kitchens didn't use the methods that we now recommend for characterizing food texture and drink consistency. And so it's very difficult to be confident that the labels that were in place before map cleanly to the labels on the IDDSI framework. So what we commonly see is people making assumptions about that mapping, and that's reasonable perhaps, but it should be avoided or at minimum declared as a limitation in a research manuscript. Another assumption that we see quite pervasively in the literature is an assumption that if a person is receiving a texture modified food, that means that they must have been diagnosed with dysphagia. And of course, this might be true, but it's also possible that food texture restrictions have been put in place for other reasons. And here, very commonly, of course, we see people suggesting softer foods for people who lack teeth, for example. And so this is a zone in which to be very careful in describing exactly what you know about the data and also clearly reporting any limitations that may exist regarding those assumptions. Another related issue that is quite a debate right at the moment relates to the presence of texture terminology words in product labels that imply that a product falls in a particular zone on the IDDSI framework, but that implication may not be backed up by IDDSI testing. One of the clearest examples at the moment relates to the use of the word puree in product labels, and you may be familiar with the fact that there are several companies that manufacture purees that are molded or shaped in the form of the food that they represent. And this has the potential to be confusing because, in fact, the process of molding and shaping those foods frequently involves the use of gelling agents that turn that pureed product into something that is more solid and is actually more likely to fall into level 7 easy to chew than it does into level 4. You'll notice here that there's a jump from level 4 to level 7 without progressing through levels 5 and 6. And this is something I think people are coming to understand, that on the food side of the IDDSI framework, foods are characterized based on multiple properties. So it's not just their hardness or their consistency, but also particle size and slipperiness or cohesiveness, adhesiveness. And so it's a mistake to assume that the use of a word like nectar or puree in a product label necessarily confirms where it falls in the IDDSI framework. So if you're a researcher and you're wanting to describe these kinds of products, then the absolute best way to handle this ambiguity is to obtain samples of those products and to test them so that you can describe their place in the IDDSI framework with confidence. So this leads very naturally into a third key message, and this is a topic that has been moving since the original release of the framework in 2016, 2017. At that time, we released the first instructions regarding the IDDSI flow test. And you will recall that we originally specified use of a standard 10 milliliter slip tip syringe. And we also identified that there were lure lock syringes that might behave the same way as the slip tip syringe. And we very quickly discovered that we hadn't provided enough specification about the syringes that would provide valid test results. And so the next step was for us to specify the length of the syringe chamber from the 0 to the 10 milliliter line as needing to be 61.5 millimeters long in order to obtain valid and reliable test results. Now, there have been a number of things happening in the world of syringes that have further complicated this story. One of these trends was the decision internationally to adopt the use of ENFit syringes in healthcare and to try to move away from the use of oral syringes in medication administration. And this quickly led to the delisting of some models of syringe and made it harder to get the ones that we had used for IDDSI flow testing. We also discovered that the Becton-Dixon or BD syringes that we had chosen had different model numbers in different countries around the world. So this has introduced challenges when we've been trying to guide people in how to access the preferred models of syringe. We also discovered that 10 milliliter syringes are not always 10 milliliter syringes. And so in Japan, for example, there's a very popular brand of syringe manufactured by Terumo, which is called a 10 milliliter syringe, but actually is a 12 milliliter syringe. And so that it became increasingly important to specify the model and number of a syringe used in IDDSI flow testing. And unfortunately, we discovered that it wasn't a simple matter of translating from one syringe to another. Now, what does this mean for people who are doing research? This means that increasingly in your methods section, you should expect reviewers and editors like me to ask you to very clearly identify which syringes you used for testing the flow properties of liquids used in your research experiment. And unfortunately, if you haven't used one of the syringes that we are showing here on the slide, that we are confident conform to the specifications of syringes that will provide valid IDDSI testing results, you're going to run into challenges, and you may in fact be asked to go back and repeat that testing with the appropriate syringe model and product number. So definitely try to get a hold of the right syringe at the outset. And IDDSI is shortly going to be coming out with a new IDDSI funnel testing device, which is also valid for flow testing. And hopefully that will mitigate some of the supply and demand challenges that people are experiencing. A fourth key message or lesson that has been emerging from the literature regarding IDDSI and its use in research is around the testing that is required to confirm the label of a product that falls in and around the zone of levels 3 and 4. And perhaps a better way to frame this lesson that we've been learning is that not all liquids that are thicker than level 3 are level 4. To remind you, at level 3 and level 4, the flow properties of the liquid, whether it flows out of that syringe and how much it leaves behind in that syringe after 10 seconds, is only one of 3 characteristics that need to be understood with respect to characterizing the texture of a food. And remember that the food side of the pyramid begins at level 3. So we're also interested here in confirming the particle size, which doesn't apply really at level 3 and only starts to apply a little bit at level 4 with respect to whether there are any particles inside that puree and how large they are, but also how sticky or adhesive that product is. And so we have come to understand, and I think the world is starting to come to understand, that just because a product is not flowing out of that syringe doesn't mean that it's automatically a level 4 liquid. We have come to accept that, in fact, some products are excessively sticky. And this is another place where they jump from not being level 4 immediately past levels 5 and 6 because they don't have particle size really as a property, to becoming foods that are best described as being level 7 regular. And so as shown here on the slide, we've recently really turned to emphasizing the fact that supplementary tests are needed at levels 3 and 4 to properly characterize the properties of items in that range, so that at level 3, you need the fork drip test in addition to the IDDSI flow test. And at level 4, you also need to add the spoon tilt test to properly understand the stickiness properties of the bolus. And so to point you to the IDDSI audit tools that are available on our website, which identify the mandatory or minimally required tests that must be completed to confirm where an item in the level 3, level 4 zone falls on the IDDSI framework. A fifth key message that I want to leave with you is the encouragement to consider using the IDDSI Functional Diet Scale, or FDS, to capture and describe the range of foods that a patient or a research participant is consuming on their diet, and as a tool for tracking progression in a patient's diet over time, whether that be improvement or deterioration. And here we're suggesting the IDDSI FDS as an alternative to other tests that have been used for this purpose historically, and the most obvious tests in that list would be the Functional Oral Intake Scale, the FOIS, developed by Crary and colleagues, the DOS, the Dysphagia Outcome Severity Scale from O'Neill and colleagues, and the ASHA-NOMS scale for dysphagia. So here I just want to issue one little caution and to recognize that the diet texture recommendation made by the clinician is a proxy for dysphagia severity, but it needs to be recognized as a proxy. And the main distinction in using the IDDSI FDS compared to these other scales is the distinction I've already mentioned, that diet here is not a single level on the framework, but spans a range of levels on the framework between the food texture recommendation and the liquid recommendation, that those are boundaries of a range that the clinician feels comfortable with the patient receiving. And then moving to my final lesson learned, and here I'm jumping on my own personal researcher soapbox to talk just for a moment about the statistical properties of IDDSI levels and IDDSI functional diet scale scores, and to really encourage people to use appropriate statistics when analyzing these numbers. So the IDDSI levels are categorical. They are not a continuous scheme of numbers, and they do have boundaries. And although we chose to use numbers in the labeling scheme, that's really just coincidental, and we could have chosen other conventions. I often say to people, we could have called these things January, February, March, and April, rather than 0, 1, 2, and 3. And so the problem of having numbers associated with these levels is that it mistakenly leads people to think that they can do statistical analyses with them, assuming that they're a continuous scale. The IDDSI functional diet scale scores can also be treated as categorical, but they are in fact ordinal, so that if you have one more level included in the range of textures on your diet, then you get a higher numeric score. But it's really important, both for the framework and for the IDDSI FDS, to recognize that there is no such thing as a decimal place. You can't assign somebody to level 3.5 on the IDDSI framework. It doesn't exist. And indeed, you can't really have an IDDSI functional diet scale score of 3.5 levels on the framework. So I would really strongly encourage you to treat these either as categorical or as ordinal variables in research and in statistical analysis. The only exception to this recommendation comes if you are reporting flow test measures and you want to report down to a unit that is reflected by the lines between the numbers on your syringe. And those lines are in 0.2 millimeter increments. And so I would encourage you to use that as the smallest resolution of IDDSI flow test results that are being reported in milliliters. However, as a rule, we are encouraging people to use the superordinate IDDSI level as the unit for flow test reporting. The consequences of this really come down to your choice of statistical analysis approach in research, such that parametric approaches like ANOVAs or linear regression are not suitable approaches for analyzing units according to the IDDSI framework or the IDDSI FDS. If you are wanting to report differences in IDDSI level data, then I would encourage you to use frequency-based or count statistics. And so that will lead you into tests like chi-squares or Fisher-exact tests or odds ratios. And if you are wanting to go one step further than that and you're looking at IDDSI FDS scores, because that measure is ordinal, you do have the option to consider non-parametric rank-based statistics like Wilcoxon-signed rank tests or Mann-Whitney U tests or Kruskal-Wallis tests depending on the research question that you are exploring. So with that, I've really been through the key messages or themes that seem to be hot topics right now with respect to use of IDDSI in research. And I'm going to stop at this point and throw the webinar open to an interactive question and answer session and look forward to discussion with you.